Well, Paul is going to return to Jerusalem in chapters 21, 22, and 23. We're taking 3 because they're short chapters. And so, as you may recall, chapter 20 concluded with that very tender meeting between Paul and the Ephesian elders. He deliberately went into Miletus, which is on the other side of the peninsula, so he had the elders come to him to avoid the crowds. And he gave his famous farewell address. That is one of his major sermons or speeches. And we can compare how well they did by comparing Jesus' epistle to the Ephesian in Revelation chapter 2. But so now he's going to board a ship for the voyage that will return him to Israel and to Jerusalem. And along the way, he's going to get some warnings. And it's a controversy among scholars whether this was a big mistake or not. So we'll take a look at that. He does know that there's trouble awaiting him. So chapter 21, verse 1. And it came to pass that after we were gotten from him and had launched, we came with a straight course to Kos, and the day following unto Rhodes, and from thence to Patara. And finding a ship sailing over unto Phoenicia, we went aboard and sent forth. You look for a longer, a less local kind of ship there, chapter 2. And it says we had gotten from them as a strange translation. The more modern translations, like the International Standard Version, says, when we had at last torn ourselves away from them, is really the way we might say that today, torn themselves away. And so, now when we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand and sailed into Syria and landed at Tyre, for there the ship was to unlade her burden. And finding disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul through the Spirit that he should not go up to Jerusalem. Here's another one of these warnings that he's picking up along the way. And some argue that this is the biggest mistake of his life because from that point on, he's imprisoned. And if he hadn't gone to Jerusalem, he lost 2 years, if you will, of productivity. There's another side to that story, but that's a very common view held by many of the scholars. And when we had accomplished those days, we departed and went our way, and they all brought us on our way with wives and children till we were out of the city, and we kneeled down on the shore and prayed. Very picturesque, of course. Verse 6. And when we had taken our leave one of another, we took ship, and they returned home again. And when we had finished our course from Tyre, we came to Ptolemais, and saluted the brethren, and abode with them 1 day. And they always met with Christians along the way, and if you've been following the exploits of Philip, the deacon, this was his region, and these may be all fruits of his work. And that's speculation, but it's a reasonable one if you have the total picture. Or these also could be converts from the Feast of Pentecost, which actually had occurred 26 years earlier. As we read the book of Acts, we don't sometimes feel the time that goes by from chapter 2 to chapter 21 is about 26 years. And now the other perspective here is there must have been millions of believers in the Roman Empire by the end of the first century. So these efforts that we see, only a portion of them recorded in the book of Acts, have been very productive. We've really, in the book of Acts, just looked at 2 guys, Peter and Paul, and Philip the deacon. Really 3 are featured. There's obviously a handful of others that have been very, very productive. Thomas went off to India, and we have some records of some of them as to where they went. So, and the next day, we that were of Paul's company departed, and came to Caesarea. And we entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him. You know, I've always wondered where they get the idea that the Philip we read so much about in Acts is not Philip the apostle, it's Philip the deacon of Acts chapter 7, or chapter 6 and so forth. And this is one of the places that it clarifies that, I believe. And the same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. Now this is the Philip that was one of the 7 deacons that's earlier in the book of Acts. And he's the one that was evangelizing in Samaria, where the Lord supernaturally had him show up down the Gaza Road and encounter the Ethiopian treasure that we developed in the previous segment. And so I've always wondered how we can discern which Philip. Was it Philip the apostle or Philip the deacon? And it's clear all the way through it's been Philip the evangelist, as they sometimes say, or he's the deacon, if you will, of one of the original 7 deacons. But moving on then. And as we tarried there many days, there came down from Judea a certain prophet named Agabus. And so it's, it's interesting, some 15 years before, Paul and Agabus had worked together in that famine relief program for Judea back in chapter 11. So they were not strangers to each other. But continuing here, and when he was come back unto us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his own hands and feet, and said, Thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owns this girdle, and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. It's a very colorful way of communicating. By demonstration, that's exactly what did happen. And Paul was not surprised, and he was ready for whatever. So this guy Agabus is, again, as I say, it was chapter 11 where we encountered him before. And this same style of expression, actually acting it out, of course, occurs in Jeremiah 13 and 27, and in Isaiah 20, and almost litters the book of Ezekiel all the way through, actually acting out prophecies, if you will, in the forms of little skits or efforts. Continuing verse 12, and when we heard these things, both we and they of that place besought him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, What mean ye to weep and to break my heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. And this characterizes Paul all the way through. You really study this guy's life. He was venturesome. He had no fear. And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, The will of the Lord be done. And after those days we took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. And that's about 60 miles between Caesarea and Jerusalem, so that's quite a trek. Now, one of the questions that comes up, was Paul supposed to go or not? Against this are these repeated messages that obviously sound like warnings for him not to go out, to stay out of Jerusalem. For over 20 years this goes on. The Lord commanded Paul to get out of Jerusalem because the Jews would not receive his testimony, okay? Paul had already written to the Romans about the dangers in Judea. We saw that in Acts 15. And he shared the same feelings with the Ephesian elders back in the previous session. And so he's fully aware of the problems that he's encountering. In favor of his going are the prophetic utterances that can be taken as warnings, like get ready, rather than prohibitions. They're warnings rather than prohibitions. And so these are obstacles, not barriers, if you will. And so Agabus did not forbid Paul to go. He only told him what to expect if he did go. And that's exactly what happened. And as for the Lord's command in Acts 22:18, it applied to that particular time and need not be interpreted as a prohibition governing the rest of his life. And so it's true he avoided Jerusalem. It is also true that he returned there on a number of occasions. For the famine relief offering that he brought in chapter 11, to attend the Jerusalem conference that occupies obviously Acts 15, and after his second missionary journey. And so in view of his statement in Acts 23, verse 1, the Lord's encouraging words, and subsequently in this chapter, it is difficult to believe that the apostle deliberately disobeyed the revealed will of God. Some people feel that he disobeyed the revealed will of God, and I don't think so. And God's prophecy to Ananias when he came off the Damascus Road came true in the months that followed, because he had an opportunity to witness for Christ. Anyway, let's move on to verse 16. There went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Mnason of Cyprus, an old disciple, with whom we should lodge. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. Now this old disciple, or ancient or early disciple, may have been an original Cypriot from the day of Pentecost, but that's a speculation. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And so that theme continues. And this is where he presents this very major offering. Great famine had impoverish the local believers. And many people, there's a great irony here, because the guy that was persecuting him so severely in his earlier life is now the one that's bringing a huge offering to relieve their suffering. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And so see, even though the Jews are free from the law, they if they're Christians, that doesn't mean that they can't observe it, or even though they are no under the law. There's a difference between being under the law, looking to it for salvation, and simply observing the practices of the past. And that's what Paul develops in detail in his epistle to the Galatians. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear what thou art come. He's hoping he's going to clarify some of these things, see. And from all this, you get the impression that the legalists, sometimes called the Judaizers, had been working behind the scenes. And no sooner than he finished his report than the elders brought up the rumors that were being circulated by Paul among the Jewish Christians. So he's finding he's a victim of those rumors again. And it, as they say, a rumor doesn't have a leg to stand on, but it travels mighty fast. So, and that's going on here. So verse 23, Do therefore this that we say unto thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Now these 4 men are apparently Nazarites, and there's a temple procedure they're asking Paul to involve himself in. He's not taking a vow. Many people misunderstand what follows here, but he is participating in their coming off that vow, which was the Jewish custom. And so it gets very controversial here. A Nazarite vow is all explained in number 6, by the way, if you want to get into that. And they've been on for 30 days. The last 7 are in the temple courts. They cut their hair and burn it. After a prescribed offering, the 4 he-lambs of the first year are offered. This is all part of that normal procedure. This is very expensive, by the way. It involves a loss of trade and the cost of the offerings themselves. And so sponsorship of a Nazarite was considered a praiseworthy thing to do. And they're expecting Paul to do that as a way of showing that he hasn't forsaken his Jewishness. Doesn't put him back into the law. He's not taking a vow. That's often misunderstood. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. And so, see, the leaders are suggesting that he demonstrate publicly his reverence for the Jewish law. And all they asked was that he identify himself with the 4 men under the Nazarite vow, and pay their sacrifices, and be with them in the temple for their time of purification. And he agreed to do that. And many scholars are troubled by that. As touching the Gentiles which believe, these are the elders speaking, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled things, and from fornication. The very elements that were in the letter that came out of Acts 15, if you will. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And so is it a mistake for Paul to observe this procedure? That's one of the concerns some people. He's still a Jew, and he's simply accommodating this as a ritualistic, customary thing. He's not looking to it for salvation or anything like that. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. Now, this is an introduction, by the way, to the closing of Luke's whole account. This is where things start to close the passion here. Many visitors in Jerusalem were there because it was the Feast of Pentecost again, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. That's a misunderstanding. He had not done that. Everybody's. See, for they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, which is an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought him in the temple. In other words, he had a buddy that was a Gentile, and they assumed he was with them in the temple. That's a presumption that they're trading on. It's not true. Anyway, all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, and they drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. This is a big ruckus, a very serious thing. Now, the evidence here was against Paul's enemies. Paul had Timothy circumcised before him along on that second missionary journey back in Acts 16. In other words, he is practicing Jewish practices. Paul had taken a Jewish vow while in Corinth, and it was his custom not to offend the Jews in any way by deliberately violating their customs, the law of Moses. That was he deliberately tried to keep his conscience free of offense toward God and toward man, was his guideline. And but so they're accusing him of being non-Jewish. He's very Jewish in what he's doing. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now that would panic any Roman leader, because that's what the Romans wouldn't tolerate, the upheaval here. Anyway, this chief captain of the band, who immediately took the soldiers and the centurions and ran down unto them, and when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. I can imagine. And the guy's name is Claudius Lysias, and the chief captain. We'll find out more about him in a minute. Then the chief captain came near and took him, and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another, among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty of the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. And the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him!" So he's really intervening here to save Paul's life, but he's trying to figure out what's going on. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days made an uproar and led us out of the wilderness, 4,000 men that were murderers?" There was an incident that the Romanist thinks he may be associated with. And we learned something about that from Josephus. There was a dangerous Egyptian that he's talking about that came out of Egypt, claimed to be a prophet, advised a multitude of followers to go with him to the Mount of Olives, and at his command the walls would fall down. And Felix was informed, the soldiers with weapons attacked, the Egyptian escaped. And you get all of that out of Josephus. And this guy thinks that he's somehow associated with that, because that was recent. But Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city." Tarsus was one of the major cities in that era, largest universities and all that sort of thing. "And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying. Now, the Roman may not know what he's talking about, but when he found out he's Jewish, he gave him permission to speak Hebrew to the Jewish crowd that's in such an uproar, assuming that might quiet things down. And so, now you understand Paul's attitude, as he described. In fact, even Romans 9 in his letter, he would have yielded his salvation for them. He loved the Jews. He was called to be apostle of the Gentiles, but his heart was still to his own brethren. So it brings us to chapter 22, and this is his defense against the mob in Jerusalem. He's able to pause on the steps, get permission to speak to the crowd, and before it's all over, the Romans got to intervene again to save his life. But let's get ahead of the story here. Acts 22, verse 1. "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you." And when they heard that he spake in Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. In other words, they were surprised, obviously. And this is the first of 5 sermons that we're going to see here. "I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God as ye all are this day." So that's his introduction. And the fact that he was instructed by Gamaliel himself, that would have been the highest teacher of that period, very venerated rabbi. And Tarsus, as I say, is a major city. It was the center of Greek learning in that day, and finest Greek university. Was not in Athens or Corinth, by the way. It was in Tarsus. And so the thriving city and so forth. And yet brought up in this city, and that's the contrast. See, he had the best Greek education you could get, but he also had the best Hebrew education that you get. Both his father was, of course, a Pharisee, Paul's father, and he was taught by Gamaliel himself. And yet we learned from this that he had a sister that lived in Jerusalem, and she may have been the one that took care of him while he was growing up there. And so, now Rabbi Gamaliel I was the president of the council after the death of his own father, Rabban Simeon, the son of Hillel himself, apparently. And so he was Paul's master, the 35th of what they call the receiver of the traditions. That's from the days of Ezra. But I'd say Tarsus was the center of Greek learning, finest university, and so on. And I persecuted this day, Paul continues, and I persecuted this day unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. As also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom I have received letters unto the brethren. And I went to Damascus to bring them which were bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. Now, he's speaking of his zeal in those early years for Judaism. And I persecuted this way. That's the way Paul refers to the Christian way. It was considered almost like a sect or splinter group from within Judaism. And what is the way? Jesus answered that in John 14:6. I am the way. We don't have a religion, we have a person that we're dealing with. And so he doesn't mention the church or Christians. He uses a term which they would understand. And it came to pass that as I made my journey, now he's going to explain his conversion here. And it came to pass that as I made my journey, and it was come nigh to Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell unto the ground, and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? You know, we're so familiar with that phrase, but let's realize what Jesus is saying. When you persecute the church, you're persecuting him, as you're touching his body, so to speak. And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? I love that. He said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spaketh unto me. And this follows the account we read in chapter 9. Notice that Paul was sought. He didn't see Christ. Christ sought him. That's always the way it is, whether we realize it or not. And there's no contradiction here with 9, because there the men heard the voice, but we understand by comparing the two, they heard the sound, but they didn't understand the words. They didn't understand what the voice said, in other words. Some people, skeptics, jump on this as a contradiction between here and chapter 9, verse 7. But that's contrived. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of the light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And this is also the source of what many people suspect became an eye problem. We notice from some of the letters that there's clearly he apparently had both unsightly and probably not marginally functional eyes. And some presume this may be an after effect from this experience that he's recounting here on the Damascus Road. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, being of good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came unto me, and stood, and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. In the same hour I looked up upon him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and should hearest the voice of his mouth. There's that term. Obviously he has chosen thee. Chosen is actually appointed, that predestined, in other words. But the just one, there's a term that occurs 7 times in the Scripture as a title of the Messiah. And we find it here, of course. Pilate's wife referred to him that way in Matthew 27. Pilate himself washed his hands and referred to him that way in chapter 27, verse 24. The centurion at the cross used that phrase, and Peter's sermon in Acts 3 uses that phrase. Stephen before the council used that phrase, and then Peter in Peter's letter. So it's interesting. I wouldn't make too much of it, but it's fascinating that these kind of uses are a multiple of 7. And it may seem like making something out of nothing, but I'm fascinated because I see these as subtle but vivid evidences of design. And the more you study your Bible, the more you'll discover in some strange ways it's designed. And I've come to the conclusion, you have to come to your own conclusions about this, but that every number, every detail, the structure of the text, the structures that lie underneath the text, evidence deliberate design. But let's just move on here. And now tarriest thou. Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And be baptized. Now this is the King James translation of this conveys the impression that it was necessary for Saul to be baptized when Ananias was talking to him there, to be saved. But that's not the case. Saul washed his way by calling on the Lord. And Kenneth Weiss, the expert in Greek, translates it this way: having arisen, be baptized and wash away your sins, having previously called upon his name. In the Greek, it is not a present participle like calling, but an aorist participle, once and only kind of thing, having called. His calling on the Lord preceded his baptism. A subtlety, but some people misunderstand this, and it gets into a whole discussion of you are instructed to be baptized, but that's not what washes away the sins. Anyway, and it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. Now this is interesting because in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul recounts in the third person an out-of-body experience. He just makes a brief allusion to it. But many people suspect this is an allusion to that same event. Whether it is or not, it's up to you. Check it out yourself and come to your own conclusions, but it is possible that that's what he was talking about. In any case, let's move on. And so I'm saying unto me, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. This is Jesus talking to Paul. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I was also standing by, consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. He was holding the coats that the people are throwing the stones at Stephen, the first martyr. And he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. This is Jesus, and he's recounting what Jesus' instruction was to Paul there. And they gave him audience unto this word. Up till now they're listening, in other words. And then lifted up their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And see, the mob, the combination of the mob ends here. You start talking about alluding to the resurrection, and they're coming unglued about that. They won't hear him anymore. The mob is going to get increasingly unruly again. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle. We're talking about the Antonia fortress probably. And bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And now see, the centurion here probably didn't understand either Hebrew or Aramaic, so he's confused. He didn't know what Paul was saying. He just suddenly realized that the crowd had become unruly again. And if a riot damaged any property, he could be held responsible. If he were proven neglectful, he could lose his post. So he's concerned here. And now Paul is being misunderstood all the way around here. The Jews thought he had brought Trophimus into the temple and that he hadn't done that. The captain thought he was an Egyptian that was a riot leader, and he wasn't that man. And notice who he is. He's a Hebrew who can speak fluent Greek. This was an anomaly to him. But the big surprise is coming because he is also a Roman citizen and is thus entitled to certain protections. So he's now going to appeal to that citizenship to escape the scourging of a prisoner, because they're about ready to scourge him. And as they And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? And that would strike panic in the heart of the centurion leader. And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. There was an edict of Caesar Augustus that had stipulated that all Roman citizens were to be exempted from flogging, and that prior to any trial before a magistrate, a formal charge had to be made against them. Any official permitting such floggings was publicly executed. The one thing Rome did is they enforced their laws, and there was we often are critical, perhaps, of a lot of the practice in the Roman Empire, but we fail to really allow for that, how brutal the world in general was, and Rome did its share in bringing some order to all of that. And they took these things seriously, is the point. In fact, it's tragic when you see a society that fails to uphold its own laws. The only thing worse than laws being broken is to have lawlessness. And in the United States, one of the great tragedies is the Constitution is no longer operative. And they've abandoned, in effect, the rule of law. That's terrifying to realize how much our security depends on the enforcement of laws. Let's continue here. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yea. The chief captain answered, he's obviously surprised, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. In other words, he was apparently a slave that had saved his money and bought his freedom. With a great sum obtained I this freedom. Paul said, But I was freeborn. And Paul's parents had been Roman citizens, and that became an inherent right of descendants, which is the way they operated in those days. And in fact, back in 171 BC, when Tarsus became a free city, many of its prominent citizens were awarded citizenship. That goes back to the Milton Bridge and all that. Anyway, let's get back here. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, because he had bound him. See, he's now in trouble, in effect. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So he's now making a major inquiry here. We've seen Paul's attempt to have a discourse before the mob. Now he's going to have a discourse before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin's brought down where Gentiles can observe, not in their usual council, because Gentiles couldn't go in there. But he's ordered them to come down here so he can observe what's going on here. And so, okay. And so the Gentile officers were never permitted to participate in the deliberations within the Jewish Sanhedrin. And Lysias, that's his name of the chief guy here, had been appointed by Caesar and was responsible for the protection of any person who claimed to be a citizen of Rome. Therefore he commanded the Jewish rulers to appear before him where he could not be excluded. So now we're at chapter 23, verse 1. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by to smite him on the mouth. That was illegal, by the way, under Jewish law too. But anyway, calling him the word brethren, in this context, is almost like an insult to them. He said, men and brethren. He's calling their partnership here, and this is the fifth time, by the way, there's a defense of Christ before the Sanhedrin. It all starts back there with Stephen. Now, Ananias, don't confuse him with Annas and Sapphira. That's a different guy. This is Ananias. Well, he's not exactly the high priest. I'll come back to that. But he's got a bad reputation. If you look in Josephus and other records here, he's a glutton, a tyrant, a bigot, and a murderer. He defrauded the impoverished priests of their tithes. He sent paid servants to the thrashing floors to steal corn. Anyone who resisted was bludgeoned to death. This is a bad apple, this guy Ananias. And the Talmud speaks of unpardonable conduct when what remained of sacrifice was completely devoured, so that nothing remained for the hungry priests, and that's what he did. He was eventually sent by Quadratus, the governor of Syria, to answer for his deeds before Caesar. Apparently the emperor gave his support to the priests, who returned to resume his work in Jerusalem. He was a traitor to his own nation and a puppet of the Romans, Ananias was. So let's, chapter 23, verse 3. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. This is when the priest strikes Paul. That's what Paul says to the priest, not knowing who he is, see. God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And so when he says whited wall, that's calling in Hebrew, it's a term that you'd speak of a grave. Or he's also saying, in effect, you're a barefaced hypocrite. And as later, by the way, would be dragged from a sewer in which he was hiding and killed by an assassin's dagger. That was his future. So this is unknowingly probably a prophecy by Paul, you see, that God shall smite thee, and God does, in effect, ultimately. And they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? As you have to understand, see, Paul didn't realize who he was up to this point for any of several reasons. He'd been away for a while, so he didn't know who the real high priest was. And Caiaphas was supposed to be, but the Romans appointed. There's a Roman appointment issue here, and also they were not in the Sanhedrin, so he probably wasn't wearing his robes that would identify him as a high priest. And so, and there's a third possibility that Paul has may have an eye problem here. But anyway, they stood by. See, Paul didn't realize the guy that made that command was the high priest. Revilest thou the high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. So Paul, in effect, backs off. He didn't realize he was the ruler, and he's quoting from Exodus 27, incidentally. But that's in effect like an apology. And so his lack of recognition is attributed to any three things. The uncertainty of the identity at the time. Ananias was dismissed from office and had been to Rome to answer charges against him, and only recently returned. Paul had been away for several years and would not have known the ruling high priest. Caiaphas was technically the guy. But the Jews still looked at Ananias, in spite of the fact that he'd been defrocked as their leader. Also, not being a properly convened assembly, and put together very hurriedly at the request of Lysias. The high priest was probably not wearing his robes of identity, if you will. And also could be also something that some people attribute to Paul's maybe marginal eyesight. But so Paul wrote back in Romans 13:7, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. In other words, render unto Caesar things that are Caesar's. And that was Paul's instruction in Romans 13, which we want to remember. What's remarkable about Paul's instruction to us is that he wrote that at a time when Nero was on the throne, and Nero was a certifiable nut. And I think this is a helpful term because it may help us when we face politicians of today, which we may not approve, but we need to honor the office. That's hard for me from where I come from, but I will leave that alone. Moving on to verse 6, and when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he created, I should explain, the Sadducees are the liberals of that day. They did not believe in supernatural things, did not believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees were the conservatives that they took the scripture very, very strictly, sometimes too much so. And so the two groups, in the gospel period, the Pharisees were dominant. But as we get into the book of Acts, by then the Sadducees started to dominate the Sanhedrin. And so the Sadducees, even though they're liberals, that's where the power, political power, seemed to rest. Well, Paul realizes that of the Sanhedrin, there are two different opposing groups. He cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question. He points out that the issue here has to do with the resurrection. The reason they're all upset when he mentions Christ is because Christ is presented as having risen from the dead. That gives the Pharisees a conflict, but the Pharisees endorse the resurrection of the dead, the Sadducees don't, so this gets right at a point of division between them, so they start arguing over that. And it becomes, Paul may be just driving home a fundamental reality, preaching the resurrection of Christ. But other people say he's also being politically very astute to drive this wedge in the conflict. And so, now see, Paul's background, his father had been a Pharisee and probably a very wealthy and influential man. And we had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. So while the Pharisees may not accept Christ, they did accept the concept of the resurrection, as they accepted the possibility of the supernatural, and that's what they argued about through their whole existence. So he turns this trial into a theological debate between the fundamentalists and the liberals, and there probably never has been a time when you couldn't get these two groups at each other's throat. We see that even today. Verse 9, and there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So they're using that, they're choosing to side on Paul's side here. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. So here's, again, he steps in to save Paul from the increasing emotional tension here. And this is the last sermon that Paul would preach in Jerusalem. Paul would never again set his foot in the city of David. This is the third time the Romans rescue Paul, and they're not finished. There's going to be more of all this sort of thing. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer. The Lord appears to Paul again here. Let's not miss that. And stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. So he gets a promise here by Christ himself that he's going to go to Rome. And this also, from my point of view, increases my bias that Paul was doing exactly what he should have done by going to Jerusalem. These people that are upset about some of those prophecies, I think, are not putting it in the right perspective. And and the Lord's right by him, but this is one of the darkest times of his life. And there was no prayer meeting supporting him, in contrast to when Peter had his thing back in chapter 12. The Lord stood by him. And so this is, and he's judged in his faithfulness, not in his success. He hadn't saved anybody in that crowd, but he was faithful to declaring the truth of the Lord. He's going to spend 2 years in Caesarea. You need to understand that Jerusalem is the Jewish capital, but on the seacoast there's a major city called Caesarea that's the Roman headquarters for the whole region. So Pilate lived in Caesarea. They'd come to Jerusalem for the holidays and things, but Caesarea was where the main event was for the Roman. And so, and anyway, he's going to spend 2 years in prison in Caesarea. And when he gets to Rome finally, he'll spend 3 years there. Now, Jesus said in Matthew 18, lo, I'm with you always, you may recall. A few years after Paul's conversion, when Paul's life was in danger in Jerusalem, he appeared to him at the temple and told him what to do. That was in Acts 22. We have Paul discouraged in Corinth and contemplated going elsewhere. Jesus appeared and encouraged him to stay there. That was back in Acts 18. And here, Paul was certainly at a low ebb of his ministry, and Jesus again appears to him. I'm not suggesting that was the only time, but it's interesting that at each key point, Jesus actually makes an appearance with Paul. And Paul would later receive encouragement during the storm on the way to Rome, and of course during his trial at Rome, because he makes reference to that in his final letter to Timothy. And so, continuing verse 12. And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which made this conspiracy. Wow, that's not just a closed group of a few nuts. There's 40 guys who pledged themselves, vow, to kill Paul. And so this is getting really serious. Unfortunately, the Romans realize how, well, they're going to find out how serious that is. Now, so they put themselves under a curse to do this. And there are precedents for this sort of thing in the Old Testament too. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore ye with the council signify to the chief captain, that ye bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though you would inquire something more perfectly concerning him. And we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him." So they're going to ask for another hearing, but for the real motive in getting out where he can be ambushed. And so you, as though you would inquire something more completely concerning him, and so forth. And so you want to never underestimate the ability of man to rationalize. It's very strange that there's a tendency, especially in religious people, to become the very instruments of evil and ruin the very cause they profess to cherish. But let's continue here. And when Paul's sister's son, so that's what he has a sister, he's raised him here in Jerusalem. Apparently he has a son, we don't know how old, we have reason to believe he's quite young, I'll show you why. When Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he overheard that somehow, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. And then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, "Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him." And so, I always love, what a coincidence that the kid overheard this. And I think the rabbis point out that coincidence is not a kosher word. There's no accidents in God's kingdom. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, "Paul the prisoner called me unto him and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee." Then the chief captain took him by the hand. That tells me he's probably a very small child. The chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, "What is this thou hast to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou shouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more completely, or more perfectly." And God's use of children, by the way, has a history. You can look at that both in the Old and New Testament, but we'll go on here. "But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, looking for a promise from thee." So the chief captain here has been tipped off. So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, "See thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me." And you know what a secret is? That's something you tell one person at a time, right? So, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, "Get this now, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, at the 3rd hour of the night." So there's about 1,000 men that are assigned to the Antonia fortress. And this is about half of them that are involved in this errand here. And so the garrison is about 1,000 at Antonia. Paul's attempt was 200 infantry, 70 cavalry, and 200 spearmen, or lancemen, if you will. And so this guy, he brought out the troops. I love this. "And provide them beasts, that they may set Paul on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor," who will be in Caesarea, obviously. And he wrote a letter after this manner. So he's accompanied Paul with this note. "Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greeting." You understand the style. This is an ancient style. We tend to sign our letters at the end. The traditional ancient style was the addressee and who's right up front. That sort of from to kind of thing in the memo. So this is Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greeting. And so this man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him having understood that he was a Roman. He doesn't mention that he had already violated the rules. He sort of sweeps that under the carpet. You understand his dilemma. What he's trying to resolve here is that he wanted to prove that he was diligent as a Roman should be. And I rescued him having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth unto their council. In other words, when I found out that it was a Jewish thing, I call it Jewish council, in effect. And he wants the governor to know that he's performing his duty, protecting a Roman citizen, because that's what Felix will be concerned with. And whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. That's his way of slipping out from under the accusations. He's implying that the accusations are Jewish issues for Jews to deal with. He brought that together, saw nothing that required Roman, but to protect his life, I'm bringing him to you, Felix, in effect. That's farewell. But to have nothing laid to his charge, you realize he's giving a clean bill of health here. And so now Felix is another one of these losers. Antonius Felix. He was Pilate's successor as the governor of Judea. He was made a free man by Antonia, the mother of the Emperor Claudius. He was the brother of another liberated slave, Paulus. However, and he was married to Drusilla. Now Drusilla is quite a piece of work. A Jewess who was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who left her husband to become Felix's third wife. And she was the sister of Herod Agrippa II. And we'll hear more of her as we go here. The Roman historian Tacitus said that Felix, quote, exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. That's a derogatory remark in effect. Felix was called a vulgar ruffian, and he lived up to the name. A scoundrel that exploited political situation, encouraged conflicts, and confiscated any loot that became available. So these guys are abusing their offices. And during his rule, the countryside became a center of anarchy, and the mountains of Judea became havens from which guerrilla fighters operated. In other words, in effect, he was hated by everybody. Let's move on. Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, which is halfway to Caesarea. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. And so Antipatris is about 35 miles from Jerusalem, between Joppa and Caesarea. And Caesarea's got a little way to go yet. And who, when they came to Caesarea, delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he says, I will hear thee, said he. Then thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So, now there's two kinds of provinces, by the way, senatorial and imperial. Cilicia is an imperial province under direct control of the emperor himself. So that's also a up notch here. But steps are being laid now to bring Paul face to face with the Emperor Nero. And because he's going to, under Felix, apply for his right to appeal to Caesar. Another comment before we close this off, I'd like to comment on. I'm indebted to the Schofield notes on this one. I think it's very provocative. There are several periods of life in Paul's life after his conversion that are passed over in silence. And some people feel the silences themselves are significant. He apparently spent 3 years in Arabia. There's 3 years between Damascus and his return to Tarsus, and in his journey in Arabia, from which the apostle returned in full possession of the gospel explanation, which he subsequently puts down in his letter to Galatians and Romans. The Epistle of Romans, sometimes called the Gospel according to Paul. It's a comprehensive piece of work that it's probably one of the most intellectual pieces of writing on the planet Earth, and the Epistle of the Romans. And some people ascribe, I'll get on to here, the 2 silent years in prison in Caesarea between his arrest in the temple and his deportation to Rome is another silent period. Okay. Now, it's inevitable that a trained intellect like Paul and a convinced believer in the Torah, the books of Moses, that until his conversion on the Damascus Road, he was an opposer of Christianity. Now that he's converted, he would seek the underlying principles of the gospel. He would be tenaciously, that would cause him to rethink his whole background. And so right after his conversion, he preached that Jesus is the Messiah, but the relation of the gospel to the law, and to a lesser degree to the great Jewish promises, needed clear adjustment if Christianity was to be a reasonable truth, not just dogma. And in Arabia, Paul sought and found the adjustment through revelation of the Spirit. Out of it came the doctrinal explanation of salvation by grace through faith, as wholly apart from the law, as embodied in both his letters, Galatians as a preliminary and Romans as a comprehensive exposition. So, now, but the gospel also brings the believer into great relationships, more than just being saved. A relationship to the Father, a relationship to Christ, and a relation to other believers, and also to the future promises of God. So it's not only a salvation from sin or consequence of sin, but into the amazing place in the divine counsels that he develops that in the epistles, the prison epistles. The new thing, the church, an organization with its various aspects and functions, also demanded clear revelation. And it's contrary to the method of inspiration, as explained by Paul himself, to suppose that these growing revelations were apart from three things: deep meditation, demanding quietness, and earnest seeking. And so these two silences may very well correlate with some introspection and some revelation that took Paul from the foundation of the book of Romans into the peak that if the letter to Ephesus and Colossians take, and the so-called prison epistles. And so, now whether they occurred whether this silent period is the 2 years in Caesarea is one possibility. Many scholars embrace that idea. I personally suspect there's another silence that they don't fully account, and that's in Rome, because he goes to Rome and gets acquitted. He's in Rome for a while before being arrested again and then killed. And so he's actually in Rome an interval that may also account for those insights that come from the so-called prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians especially. Well, for the next session, we're going to take another 3 chapters, and we will, I'd like you to study those 3, and I want you to summarize the predicaments of each. We're going to look at 3 confrontations. His defense before Felix, that occurs twice. Understand the predicament Felix is facing when Paul is presented, because that'll be over a 2-year period. He will have a subsequent defense before Festus, and then during which he actually appeals to Caesar. And then, of course, he finally has a defense of sorts before Agrippa. And in each one of these, you might do well to try to put yourself in the shoes of the examiner to understand the predicament that they're facing. It's very glib just to look at it as a witness opportunity by Paul before the heathen. It's quite another to try to really understand the political dynamics that are going on. So with that, let's stand for a closing word of prayer.